If there ever is a settlement on Mars, I'm sure that one of the first things they'll open up is a coffee house.
It's one of the most complex beverages on Earth.
$2 for a cup of coffee. 1 cent goes to the coffee grower.
It's mountain grown.
Coffee is the second most valuable legal traded commodity on the face of the earth, after oil.
Preto pela cor do negro que deu toda essa riqueza para o seu patrão, né?
It's just this little seed and has this enormous political, social, and economic impact on human beings.
This is the epic story of a beverage that shares its birthplace with our earliest human ancestors. In this hour, we see how coffee spreads from the ancient world, becoming the dark medium through which social, sexual, economic, and political life evolves, fostering much of what is best and worst about our civilization. From the hills of Ethiopia to the marinas of Seattle, people around the globe drink 500 billion cups of coffee a year, half of them at breakfast. Every morning, everywhere, people prepare their favorite cup in their favorite way. For sheer pleasure, few morning rituals rival a good cup of coffee.
Coffee has been at the center of conversation for hundreds of years.
Triple grande, 2% latte?
It's a social, romantic beverage. It's a theatrical experience.
The experience of coffee alters cultures and lives every place it goes. Romances are sparked, revolutions conspired, all over this dark, potent brew.
It is black and it is clearing our brain, so it produces light in our brain. Then it is something that went through fire, and it has a certain hellish connotation. So there is some black magic associated with coffee.
As the essential morning beverage, coffee delivers the largest dose of the world's most widely taken legal drug.
If tomorrow coffee were suddenly withdrawn from the world and there were no such thing as coffee anymore, people would go frantic, for one thing. I mean, they would begin to go like this.
From the bean to the cup, coffee provides a livelihood of sorts for over 25 million people. 100 million more depend on coffee for their survival. The story of coffee begins with a green bean, hidden in the red cherry of the coffee tree. Some call it magical, others say it's evil, but no matter how jealously or greedily guarded, neither kings, nor merchants, nor priests could keep it from spreading around the earth. For sooner or later, everyone is seduced by the irresistible bean. This is a saga which begins over 1,000 years ago, deep in the ancient forest of a land often called the cradle of humanity.
No one really knows who discovered coffee or when exactly it was, but we do know that it was in Ethiopia, that coffee still grows wild in the mountains of Ethiopia. And there's a wonderful legend of Kaldi, the goat herd, that makes as much sense as any other creation myth.
Isarra kan ka'e nyaata sanirraa ka'e maaliif bunni kun maalirraa nama si'eessaa jechuurraa baramee kanaan bu'an jedhantu immoo buqqisee sibiila dhaabbadhaa wanni kun waan gaariidha waan fuulduratti barbaadamu jedhee kan biyya dhaabsise isaanii kan jedhu taarikii nan dhagaye. Ijoollee re'ee tiksutu argee erga san immoo abbaa jabir baalbuu kan jedhamtu takka taattalee immoo biyya hundaafus akka faafalee kan jedhe isaanii taarikii kasaanitti nan dabarsinaa. Bunni immoo har'a buna coocee kana fakkaatu hin jiru. Akka kana immoo hin arga ijoollee re'ee tiksitu jedhanii. Gin zaman sana immoo namni fuudhee biyya akka faafalee biyya keenya qaqqabee abbaayyoo bir baay'ee kan jedhan isaanii santu biyya qaqqabee biyya hunda akka faafalee. Arras immoo wanni buna coocee kana fakkaatu hin jiru caalaa bunaati nabbaariidha. Bunni immoo biyya kana akkabaabii kana jiru akkana amma bunni kuni akka kana argame. Bunni immoo har'a buna coocee kana fakkaatu hin jiru bakka biraatiin argamu.
He suddenly felt all kinds of energy and excitement, and he started dancing around and singing, and he felt like writing poetry to his girlfriend and things like that. So that's how coffee was supposedly discovered.
Ethiopians are the first to gather coffee growing wild in the forest. It is likely, as in the Kaldi legend, that the coffee cherries are simply chewed at first, or the beans ground with fat to make an energy bar. Later, the Ethiopians brew the leaves with boiled water as a weak tea. It isn't until the 1400s that someone, perhaps accidentally, roasts the beans and discovers how good they smell. They grind them and brew a black, potent beverage. Ah, coffee.
Every Ethiopian knows coffee's birthplace is in Ethiopia. You know, Ethiopians are proud of the coffee. You know, from the not only coffee growing areas, all Ethiopians, they drink early morning coffee as a prestige. If you go to any Ethiopian house, they prepare coffee before any dish. Coffee will be family beverage. It brings friendship, kinship. The coffee is an heritage and a proud of Ethiopia's culture.
Haji Muhammad's granddaughter prepares an elaborate coffee ceremony that is centuries old. Only the women of the house can roast the beans. When they begin to crackle, she ladles them on a metal plate to be blessed by the spirits of fertility and prosperity. The ceremony commemorates the journey of 3 sheiks who went into the wilderness in search of God. When they were nearly starving, it is said, God appeared and instructed them to grind coffee beans for food. There are always 3 servings of coffee to honor the 3 sheiks. The first round is called Abel, then Tona, and finally Baraka, which means the blessing. The mistress pours the boiled coffee from high up to let the aroma permeate the room. She adds a little sugar, or sometimes salt. The brew is thick and strong, with some of the grounds still floating in the cup. The eldest is always served first. While the ancient Ethiopians revere their wild coffee, they cannot keep it to themselves. It is only a matter of time until traders bring beans to the Arabian port of Mocha. From there, the Arabs begin the first known cultivation of coffee in the nearby mountains of Yemen.
The name coffee probably comes not from Ethiopia, but from Yemen. Coffee cultivation went across the Red Sea, and so the Arabs began to grow it in Yemen. And the Arab word for wine is kawa, and that's the derivation. They thought it was kind of like a substitute for wine. It was legal, whereas wine wasn't. And so I think that coffee probably comes from the word kawa.
Some people say that coffee was named for a little town in Ethiopia called Kafta. Other people say that Kafta was named for coffee. Some people say that it came from coffee's power to forestall sleep, and that it was an old word for something that puts off your desire for something. The truth is that nobody knows where the word coffee came from.
Forestalling their desire for sleep, the Sufis are better able to perform their ecstatic devotions. The invigorating potion enhances their swirling trances as they reach out to merge with the divine. Soon, the black brew spreads from temple to temple as a holy ceremonial drink.
It was through the Sufis that coffee made its way through Arab society. See, the Sufis were of the laity. They came from all walks of life, and they used to meet at night to say their prayers. Then they'd go back home and they'd go to their jobs and so on. Well, they brought the knowledge of coffee back with them.
Very quickly it went over into secular life. Very wealthy people would have entire rooms devoted to coffee drinking, and became the social thing that you did when somebody came over. For poorer people, coffee khanas, coffee houses, sprang up, and people began to frequent them. They became huge social venues. People began to play games there, prostitutes began to hang out there.
As coffee houses become the gathering places of the poor, coffee also gains a reputation as a troublemaking social brew.
You know, there weren't many places where strangers could meet and talk and have conversations, people of all levels of society and so on. There weren't any places like that. And the coffee houses was something that no one had ever seen before. And they were considered to be a source of vice, a source of possible sedition and revolution, and with good reason, actually. Because the truth is, people do talk about politics at coffee houses.
In 1511, the governor of Mecca, whose name was Khair Beg, heard that people were doing lewd and terrible things in the coffee houses, but worse than that, they were saying bad and funny things about him. They were making up satirical verses about him. So he decided that he would ban the coffee houses.
People come there, they carry on, they mix with other people, they get involved in treason. But the worst thing is, they're drinking coffee. And coffee is a drug, it's an intoxicant. Well, the Quran prohibits the use of intoxicants. This is a very serious matter in the Muslim religion. In fact, the penalty for using intoxicants is execution. And he tried to ban the coffee houses. However, the Sultan of Cairo, who was his boss, who loved coffee and it was being served in Cairo. When he heard about this, he reversed the order.
Disputes among the ruling classes about the disreputable coffee houses only adds to the popularity of the irresistible bean. As the Turks conquer the Arab world, they inherit coffee and coffee culture. Soon, coffee secures a place for itself in the everyday lives of ordinary people. And although coffee is still enjoyed in many domestic rituals, Turkish men come to prefer the public coffee houses.
Evimizde bir kahve kültürü var, kahve içme kültürü var. Sonra erkekler arasında toplanma yeri açısından bir kahve. İlk başlarda böyle namaz aralarında bir soluklanmak, bir vakit geçirmek amaçlı, sohbet etmek amaçlı. Oraya genelde Türk entelektüelleri, yazarlar, şairler, edebiyatçılar gidiyorlar. Orada sohbet ediyorlar. Çeşitli tartışmalar yapılıyor. Hatta bugün ankormanların televizyonlarda bildiğiniz üzere günlük gazeteleri okurlar ve yorumlar yaparlar. İşte o zamanlar insanların tartıştığı, bilgi alışveriş içinde bulundukları bir yer olarak biliniyor. Kahve ve kahvehane özellikle insanların sohbet edip tartışmaları için, bir araya gelmeleri için çok önemli bir yer. Kahve de bunun için çok önemli bir araç. Ayrı bir atasözümüz vardır. Gönül ne kahve ister ne kahvehane, gönül dostu ister, kahve bahane.
Coffee has always been important for both the men and women in Turkey. But with the strict separation of the sexes, women have long been forbidden in the coffee houses. The women of the Sultan's harem drink coffee in an atmosphere of languorous sensuality. Afterwards, they have their coffee grounds read by the court fortune teller, who tells them if they are satisfying the Sultan and whom he loves the best. Even today, a young woman can still have her future divined in the grounds of her cup.
Kahve bizim kültürümüzde önemli bir yeri vardır. Kahve falı ve kahvenin. Örneğin bir genç kız evlenmeyi düşündüğü, evlilik çağındaki bir genç kız öncelikle görücü olarak gelen kişilere, kendisini görmeye gelen kişiler için niyetini belirten bir ifadeyle kahvenin içine tuz ya da şeker, eğer istiyorsa şeker, istemiyorsa tuz koyarak sunar ve karşısındaki insan da yine aynı şekilde eğer gerçekten ve karşıdaki insanın tepkisini de özellikle gözlemlerler. Eğer karşısındaki insan istiyorsa bu kişiyle evliliği, inzivacı diyeyim, kahveyi her ne olursa olsun kahvedeki içinde tuz ya da şeker içer. Terazi burcu toprak mı olur? Terazi hava, topraksınız ama.
As the taste for coffee grows, the Turks become more vigilant about protecting their beloved bean.
It was a very jealously guarded commodity, particularly after the Ottoman Turks took over. They spread coffee far and wide throughout the Ottoman Empire. So this was obviously something that they didn't want anybody to be able to grow besides them. So they were very careful to keep the monopoly. Before they exported any coffee beans, they would parboil them to make sure that they weren't fertile, that they couldn't be grown. So it became this precious commodity that people tried to smuggle out. Eventually, an Indian named Baba Budan, this is probably true, he taped some seeds around his stomach underneath his clothing and smuggled them out and began to grow some in India. Then the Dutch got hold of some fertile seeds and began growing them in their greenhouses in Amsterdam.
From Holland, the Dutch transport the precious coffee plant to their colony in Java. There, they enslave the natives and force them to cultivate coffee. By 1683, mocha and Java are the most sought-after beans, and coffee is poised to conquer Europe along with the armies of the Sultan.
It was during a siege of Vienna by an Arab sultan who had sent a tremendous army to conquer the West. And he made his way to the gates of Vienna, and he surrounded Vienna. He was about to conquer the city.
All of Europe was in the balance. They were trying to figure out who they could send to try to get some sort of reinforcements. There was a Pole named Franz George Kolschitsky who had lived in Arab lands and who spoke the language. So he dressed up as an Arab. He snuck out through the lines,
delivered a message to the French troops that they needed help. The French came, they defeated the Arabs, and the Arabs fled. In their haste, they left behind their bags of unroasted coffee.
Nobody knew what they were. They thought they were camel fodder, so they were burning them. Kolschitsky smelled it, and he said, "Oh, that's coffee. Don't burn that. I'll take it if nobody else wants it."
Having lived among the Turks, Kolschitsky knows the rudiments of roasting and brewing coffee. He soon opens the Blue Bottle, Vienna's first coffee house. Like the Turks, he adds sugar to sweeten the cup.
People in Vienna didn't like the grounds in the bottom, so they started to filter it. And they didn't like the raw taste of just plain coffee, so they started adding milk to it. And it's the way that we have it today.
Cheese.
Chin chin.
While the Viennese introduced the modern way of drinking coffee, the perfection of coffee culture takes place in Italy. But wherever it appears, there is also resistance to the exotic new beverage.
For some reason, coffee arrived in Europe with negative connotations about it. It was almost as if there was an advance warning coming. Something bad is coming, which everybody's going to like. The Turkish men went to coffee houses where they drank coffee without women. They also went to bathhouses without women, and some of the Turkish regiments had homosexuals in them. And consequently, the connection of coffee as the Turks drink meant that there was an association that coffee made you effeminate. And that was an attitude that was brought over to Venice. So there was a whole lot of ideas which stuck in people's minds because largely the whole Muslim world was closed off to the West.
Italian priests regard the Turkish foreigners and their black brew as a threat to Christianity. They petition Clement VIII to ban the evil Muslim practice of drinking coffee. But when the Pope tastes it, he reputedly finds the drink so delicious, he decides to baptize it instead. Soon, more and more contact is being made as the Turks begin to trade with Venice.
Tramite questi mercanteggi Venezia offriva qualcosa e la Turchia logicamente contraccambiava con il caffè. È stata presa con un po' di scetticismo all'inizio dai veneziani e poi dopo l'apertura del Florian nel 1720, che è stato praticamente il primo caffè che è stato aperto qui a Venezia, un po' alla volta i veneziani si sono abituati a questo caffè. I 30 anni successivi credo siano stati aperti più di 200 caffè qui a Venezia. C'era dei caffè per le persone borghesi, diciamo, e anche per i ricchi, insomma. Il Florian era uno di questi, per gente ricca, ecco.
Venetians may be taking a liking to coffee, but they're keeping their distance from Turks and other outsiders.
The Café Lavena in St. Mark's Square was well known in the 18th century because at that age Venetians didn't want to meet foreigners. So the Lavena was the foreigners' coffee shop, and the Venetians didn't come here because they come in the opposite side to the Florian. So it was a meeting point, the Lavena, for all the tourists of that age. Café Lavena is well known as the Richard Wagner's Café because he used to stay here every afternoon at 5 o'clock with his wife and his children, speaking to the owner of this coffee shop. That was Carlo Lavena, my great-grandfather. Here he was in the upper gallery writing the finest pages of Tristano und Isolde, or the second act of the Parsifal. And he stayed here also with other musicians, and they made a sort of circle of musicians in this coffee shop.
The German Richard Wagner composes at the Lavena, while the Italian Giuseppe Verdi composes at the Florian. Neither would think of crossing the piazza to meet the other. As Wagner and Verdi battle musically, others are dreaming of love, and coffee is their elixir. Since the Florian and the Lavena are frequented by women, the notorious Casanova spends hours in both cafes. As one of the few Venetians seeking romance on either side of the square, he is commemorated with a seductive coffee named just for him.
We are going to have our Casanova coffee. This is the secret recipe with the spices. And this is the espresso. We are going to mix them. And to put on the top the whipped cream. We call Casanova coffee because the recipe is really ancient, and we took these spices from the 18th century. So if you go and test this kind of coffee, the mix is really incredible.
Italians love their coffee and have greatly enriched the world's coffee culture. At Ili Cafe in Trieste, baristas learn the art of presenting the most delightful cup. Their masterpiece is the magisterial cappuccino, named for the resemblance to the color and peak on the Capuchin monk's cloak, and usually drunk, at least by the Italians, in the morning. Ernesto Ili, the grand old man of Italian coffee, knows how far the cup has come from its ancient methods of preparation. Other Europeans have developed many different systems to make their coffee, but for impatient Italians, they all take too long.
The Napolitan people are impatient. And one guy had a friend in Milano and said, listen, can you make it a little faster? I have to wait 6-8 minutes to have my cup of coffee. Put some pressure on top. And the guy put some pressure. And this was the beginning of the espresso. The espresso that is so strong in taste, in aroma, and in the body is weak in caffeine because you do not have time to extract all the caffeine that is in the ground coffee. The art of an espresso is to stop extracting when all the good stuff is in the cup and all the bad remains to be thrown away. And this means approximately 1.5 ounces. So this is why espresso must be prepared in a small cup, because the temptation to put some more water in a big cup will spoil the pleasure of a perfectly prepared espresso. So you have this funny contradiction. It is strong, smells a lot, and it has a low caffeine. This is why the Italian can drink 10 cups of coffee, espresso, in Italy. And when they visit the States and they drink 10 cups of American coffee, they get shaky because too much caffeine. When you want to be stimulated, you want to have your sympathetic system bright and powerful, you take an amphetamine, but no relaxation. If you want to be relaxed, you have a glass of wine, but no alertness. Only coffee produces alertness and relaxation, and this is what makes coffee so magic. I understand that people were feeling coffee to be magic, because it is really magic.
The cafe has always been home to artists and intellectuals. A place to give expression to caffeine-inspired eruptions of imagination and ideas. The French novelist Balzac wrote in a cafe while drinking his usual 40 cups a day. Sparks shoot all the way to the brain, he said about coffee, and the cavalry of metaphor deploys with a magnificent gallop.
So here we are in the middle of the Golden Triangle, with the Café de Flore on my left. Café de Flore, famous for writers and film stars. And here we have Le Deux Magots, another literary cafe. Usually the same kind of thing, writers, philosophers. Behind me, you have Brasserie Lippe, which is specialized in politicians, chiefs of state, and film stars.
The French, who are now very famous for coffee, were somewhat late, but still in the late 1600s, the Turkish Sultan, who was the ambassador to Paris, set this craze going for all things Arab. So all the French people would dress up with little head things, and they would lie around on their pillows, and they would drink coffee. And so coffee took Paris by storm.
The French are enamored with coffee, but they don't know how to make it. Procopio del Cortel, an Italian, seizes on this opportunity. In 1686, he opens Café Le Procope, thus introducing the French to the French café.
Évidemment, les premières à répandre la mode, ce sont les femmes, qui venaient tout simplement parce qu'elles pouvaient prendre indifféremment du thé, du café, du chocolat et des pâtisseries. Et notamment, ce que l'on avait apporté, là encore de Turquie, les premiers croissants. Pourquoi croissants? Parce que comme le croissant, des Turcs battus à Vienne. D'autre part, le café est réputé aphrodisiaque pour les hommes. Et donc, ici, là non plus, c'est pas vrai, mais c'est pas grave. Le café, c'est une boisson de femme, et donc, c'est assez logique, le café va être défendu par les femmes contre le vin, qui, lui, est réputé assoupir les performances masculines. Il venait aussi bien des femmes chic, de la haute société, d'aristocratie, que des gens qui venaient voir ce qui se passait, l'endroit à la mode, et évidemment des hommes, puisqu'il y avait des jolies femmes. Donc va se créer une société qu'on appellera la société des cafés. Et pourquoi est-ce qu'il devient français? Parce que, comme je vous l'ai dit, à Paris, mais en France en général, à cette époque-là, on se parle très naturellement. C'est la conversation qui fait le succès du café.
C'est pas toujours simple, la démocratie, c'est sûr.
Il n'y a pas de barrière de classe dans la conversation.
Par l'ancien, bien sûr.
Il n'y a pas de barrière de sexe, il n'y a pas de barrière de race, d'accent. Ça, c'est totalement original.
Que nous allions, que la société va vers la sagesse. Mais on peut dire aussi...
From the earliest days of Le Procope, the French have been gathering in cafes to engage one another in discussion and debate.
Parce que plus on a d'espace vital, plus on consomme et plus on fait de la merde. Et c'est peut-être comme ça que les problèmes se régleront.
On peut dire, par exemple...
Conversation can be raised to a fine art now that coffee is replacing wine and beer as the beverage of choice.
Tout le monde boit, les hommes, les femmes, dans la haute société, dans le bas peuple. On boit beaucoup. Et c'est pas en France on boit le plus. On boit plus en Allemagne, on boit le plus en Hollande, en Angleterre. En France, sous Louis XIV et Louis XV, donc 17e, 18e, un homme boit en moyenne 7 à 8 litres de vin par jour, plus à peu près 1,5 litre d'alcool pur par jour. Et il travaille 14, 15 heures par jour. Tout le monde boit, j'insiste bien là-dessus, même les enfants.
I believe Europe was under an alcoholic haze for decades. Then all of a sudden coffee started to come in and you found a new place where people could drink and communicate and join together without the alcohol.
Newly sober and alert, Europeans can finally take stock. Around the marble-top tables of their cafes, the French discuss events of the day and consider what might be done about them. Once again, coffee is stimulating social ferment.
The coffee shop had an important role to play. Where the coffee shop owner put newspapers around, they became places where people would congregate to have important political discussions. And I've got no doubt that it certainly helped to have a clear head. No use if you're slightly beschwipst, slightly drunk, you know, that doesn't make for good discussions about, war plans or political plans.
Very many revolutionary movements started in cafes. That's absolutely true. Because, for instance, Marat, Robespierre, Danton, they sat in, all these people were beheaded afterwards, but until they had their head, they could talk and discuss and really do something.
C'est ce que fait Camille Desmoulins. Après la chute de la Bastille, il donne rendez-vous à ses partisans au Café de Foix. Et c'est là où Camille Desmoulins fait cette fameuse déclaration. Il prend une feuille d'un arbre du Palais Royal et il a dit « Nous devrions porter, comme je fais moi-même, une cocarde à notre chapeau pour nous reconnaître. » Et c'est effectivement là que du coup, le Café de Foix devient le café des, entre guillemets, cocardiers, ceux qu'on appellera les révolutionnaires.
The revolutionary tradition of cafes lives on in the ideals and passionate intensity of new generations, as does the tradition of cafes as the setting for great love affairs.
When I was a student and I just entered and got out immediately because I couldn't afford to buy a cup of coffee here because we're very poor. But I did have a glimpse of Sartre and Beauvoir because I came up here and I saw them at separate tables and I was very impressed. And then, well, with time, of course, I was a student, I did get into cafes because everybody was sitting in cafes. The cafe as an institution is like a living theater. You go to a cafe to look, to be looked at, to pick up a woman or a man according to what you want. It belongs to this kind of tradition. To go to the loo, to buy some cigarettes if you smoke, if you still smoke, and just to be surrounded by people. Really, in this very close society of ours and everything, you can start a conversation in a cafe. And perhaps even to establish a kind of relationship after talking, but you can do it. I mean, it's not rude to talk to somebody whom you meet, and eventually that can develop into a love story.
Although there are many who claim to have opened the first coffee house in Europe, it is actually a Jewish immigrant from Lebanon who deserves the honor for opening the Angel in, of all places, England. Nowhere else does the coffee house have the effect of a liquid torrent pouring over the country.
It was the British, oddly enough, because we think of them as being tea drinkers primarily, but they became the big coffee drinkers. By 1700, there were 2,000 coffee houses in London alone, and every single coffee house had its specialty. The writers would go to one, the bankers would go to another one, and the seafarers would go to another one. It was this ferment of intellect. They were called penny universities because for a penny you could get a cup of coffee and you could have these fantastic conversations.
Of course, people were curious to know what was happening, and they would go to these coffee establishments. And indeed, people wanted to get away from the pubs because you could actually go into a coffee house, and without alcohol, you could actually work through your what you were doing, your business, and so the coffee houses became the kingpin on which the social and the commercial life of London, the City of London, revolved.
We're here now in the heart of the City of London.
Castle Court, it's no more than 1, 2, 3, it's less than 4 feet wide. All of a sudden it's oozing atmosphere and almost being carried back 300 years. And now the Holy of Holies, this is the corner site of the Jamaica Coffee House. This is the site where Pascal Rosé started his first London coffee business in 1652. Pascal Rosé was set up in business by his boss, who had these trading connections with Turkey. He brought the coffee back, was making it in his home, and he had so many guests, so many people loved this aroma of coffee, roasted ground coffee. So he set up his servant, saying, well, you better start a trend in the city. And so this is where he did it. Behind me is the Royal Exchange, which was established in the 16th century. And around here, once the coffee bars had been opened in 1652, the traders thought they'd found somewhere else to go, to get away from things. And here we are at Change Alley, the most important little thoroughfare for the coffee houses in the whole of the City of London. And it was here that Jonathan's established his business so that the stockbrokers could come over from the Royal Exchange and have their coffees here in the morning, do their business and relax, no doubt, over lunch and have a nice time in the afternoons.
London coffee houses spawn many of the city's important businesses and customs. The Tatler, which becomes one of the early magazines, begins as a broadsheet with reports on the gossip and more enlightened debates overheard in the coffee houses. The tradition of tipping is said to have originated in the coffee house, where patrons tossed money in a bowl labeled "to ensure promptness," or tip for short. Edward Lloyd's insurance business starts out as a coffee house on Lombard Street, catering to seafarers and merchants.
The story goes that Lloyd's of London, as the insurance company, was established because this is where the ship's captains used to come with reports of when they'd arrived in port and with what cargoes. And so it became a place where the information about shipping cargoes was largely exchanged so that insurance contracts could be made.
Lloyd's Insurance, when they moved up from the Royal Exchange area, came here and they built this lovely facade, which was this opening for the new Lloyd's building. And then in more recent years, they built this enormous modern structure behind me, which is today the Lloyd's of London.
London's social and commercial life has always been a man's world. In the past, women were not even allowed inside coffee houses, unless they worked there. As in Paris, the women of 17th century London associate coffee with sex. But unlike the women of Paris, British ladies, excluded from the coffee houses, have a very different idea of the relationship.
There was an idea that coffee was bad for sex. It made men very weak when it came to sex, etc. So all these funny ideas came and they were interpreted and misinterpreted wherever they went. So that by the time that coffee arrived in England, and you must remember England was a very wealthy place at the time, there was an idea around that coffee really was bad for sexual activity. And we can see that in the very first pamphlets put out by the ladies of London in a thing called the Maiden's Complaint.
Which, among other things, said, when they come home, our gallants have nothing moist but their noses, nothing stiff but their joints, and nothing standing but their ears. So it was very funny. The men wrote a response to this, by the way, where they said that that wasn't true, that coffee, in fact, added a spiritual essency to the sperm and made them much better lovers.
In actual fact, the coffee houses were full of prostitutes upstairs, and the reason for the Maiden's Complaint was that the husbands were slipping upstairs with Catherine for a sixpenny special, coming downstairs for a cup of coffee, and when they arrived home and the wife said, "How about it?" they would say, "I'm sorry, I just had a cup of coffee." And so that's where the problem started. And of course it continued in a folkloric manner from mother to daughter, mother to daughter. This is what coffee does to you, etc.
The women never did get into the coffee houses. What eventually happened was that the coffee houses became private men's clubs, and there were public tea rooms beginning in the early 1700s where women and children could go. And so tea took over from coffee for a variety of reasons.
There was this taste for tea, and of course people would talk about the latest fashion for tea.
Tea becomes not only more sociable and democratic, it is cheaper and simpler to make. And the British, not known for their culinary skills in any case, never really learned to make a good cup of coffee.
Coffee was also much more difficult to make. You had to roast the coffee grounds, you then had to grind or pulverize the coffee grounds in some way, and then you had to make it. Now, coffee making isn't therefore an easy thing to make, but the coffeehouse proprietors said, look, just a minute, this tea leaf, you don't have to roast it. It's already there. All we've got to do is put it in the pot, add the water, and hey presto, we've got a drink which is absolutely marvelous. And suddenly tea became very, very popular. The women liked tea. You had this introduction of the afternoon tea, and the charm and the courtesy and the culture of tea was a very nice, enjoyable experience. And it was the one time of the day when the women knew that they could talk to their children, so it was a family thing. And the imports of tea rose dramatically. And then there was profit to be made in tea.
There was the British East India Company, which had a monopoly on tea from China, and that they wanted to sell that. So by the end of the 1700s, England had become primarily a tea-drinking country.
And so tea became well and truly established. We forgot all about coffee.
Until recently, the average Englishman would drink the same amount of coffee in a year that the average Italian drinks in only 2 days. For the rest of the time, it's time for tea.
What a pleasure it is to make tea, and what a pleasure it is to drink it. Nectar.
As the British trade in tea grows, so does the continent's taste for coffee. In 1700, Europeans are consuming 500,000 pounds of coffee. 100 years later, their consumption has grown to 100 million. And the French are eager to expand their trade. The opportunity comes when a young French lieutenant charms a royal mistress.
Initially, Lieutenant de Clieu was able to get hold of one coffee plant from the French hothouse, which was owned by the king, by seducing one of the king's mistresses, and she gave him the coffee plant.
Gabriel Mathieu de Clieu brings the single coffee plant on a voyage across the Atlantic, nursing it with tenderness and care. He shares half his water ration with the seedling during a drought and protects it from jealous passengers and other threats.
There was an evil Dutchman aboard who ripped off one of the leaves of his plant because he didn't want him, the Frenchman, to bring the plant over. There were pirates who attacked the ship, and he had to protect his coffee plant against the pirates. There was a big storm. But finally, he brings his coffee plant over. He plants it in Martinique. It thrives, and from that single plant, most of the coffee that's now grown in the entirety of Latin America probably descends from that one plant.
But just as the desire for coffee stimulates the age of reason and democracy, it also imposes colonialism in the Americas. The French, like other European nations, established large slave-run plantations to cultivate the precious bean.
After de Clieu brought the coffee tree to Martinique, it spread, particularly in French-owned islands, and one of them was named San Domingo, which is now Haiti. By 1790, half of the world's coffee was grown on this one island. It's really quite remarkable, but under appalling conditions by slaves who had been imported from Africa. In 1791, they revolted. The first thing they did was to destroy all the sugar and the coffee plantations. And as a result of this, Haiti has been the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere.
The slave struggle lasts for 12 years. In a vain attempt to regain Haiti, Napoleon deploys his troops. But they cannot suppress the uprising. It is the largest successful slave revolt in history. When Napoleon learns of his troops' defeat, he exclaims in fury, "Damn colonies, damn coffee."
It's ironic that the reason the slaves revolted in 1791 was that 2 years before, the French Revolution had begun, And in large part, the French Revolution had been planned in coffee houses, and coffee had been one of the germs for it, getting people to think and plot the revolt. So coffee, at the same time, was revolutionizing Europe, but also the slaves were revolting against the way they were being forced to grow it.
Wherever coffee has been introduced, it has brought revolution or change. Coffee, which has given so much pleasure to Europe, will bring enormous pain to Africa, where it comes from, and the colonies, where it's going. The irresistible bean is about to catch fire across the ocean, and it will transform the economies, ecologies, and politics of all the Americas.
Senekala luwo, Senekala luwo, Senekala luwo, Senekala luwo. Anije, anibara, Anije, anibara, Anije, anibara, Anije, anibara. Senekala luwo, Senekala luwo.